Attacks may be made in many ways, with bombs or with biological weapons. This might be one form of biological warfare.
Biological warfare? What do they expect me to do about it? It's not my headache.
You're wrong. You had better find out the facts about biological warfare, or BW.
Welcome back to the Truth Factory. Let's talk about Ukraine. The government and mainstream media is saying, or strongly implying, that Putin is just a crazy guy, invading Ukraine spontaneously for no excusable reason, and that this justifies the US getting involved in bankrolling another foreign war with your tax dollars. And any other narrative, according to the US military, is just Russian disinformation and propaganda being pumped out by evil bots and troll farms. Don't question the narrative, don't think for yourself, believe the ever-changing story that the mainstream news and your government tells you to. But wars have two sides, and this is a side that your government doesn't want you to know about. According to the Russians, Putin had ordered his military to seek and destroy US-funded deep state biolabs engaged in top-secret zoonotic and infectious disease research in several locations across Ukraine. And the original airstrikes do match up fairly consistently with the supposed locations of these bio-research facilities. However, the US and the EU and unnamed Ukrainian officials denied any rumors that there were US-funded bioweapons labs in Ukraine. The media and fact-checkers, rather than doing the bare minimum amount of research to actually fact-check this, called it debunked.
Talking about that would be Russian President Vladimir Putin. He is addressing his people right now, and basically, I mean, it's all in Russian, so we don't have a translation for you, but I can tell you what he is saying. Not that I speak Russian.
Russia has a history also of inventing outright lies like this, which is the suggestion that the United States has a chemical and biological weapons program, or Ukraine does, that they're operating. Russia is the country that has a chemical and biological weapons program. So the objective was to make clear the inaccuracy of the information, the misinformation they're trying to put out.
The initial response was just to deny it and hope no one looks further into it. Yet here I am, looking further into it, at these actual contracts signed by the Department of Defense and the Ukrainian Minister of Health for these labs. In the contract, it says that the Ministry of Health of Ukraine shall consolidate and store all dangerous pathogens at secure centralized laboratories that have or are receiving U.S. Department of Defense assistance under this agreement. So not only do they exist and are U.S. funded, they are in fact storing dangerous pathogens. Here's a picture of one of these labs, clearly working with dangerous biohazard material because they have a giant sign on their wall that translates to biological danger. Now please watch this propaganda video that your government made in 2020 about these labs. You know, the labs that your government and the media just denied the existence of.
The work we do in the Biological Threat Reduction Program is complicated, and it's difficult to communicate it sometimes to outside audiences. And I think our adversaries like Russia can take advantage of that with some of the propaganda that they put out.
We've had accusations that some research projects were being used to create threats, not to identify threats and reduce them.
The laboratory is there to both store dangerous biological pathogens from the Soviet era and to conduct research by Kazakhstani scientists in order to prevent the spread of new biological pathogens.
They're just retaining deadly Soviet-era viruses for your health. Yeah, let's store anthrax so that we'll all be healthy.
We have complete transparency in the type of work we do. This is a way that we help counter the propaganda that we get from Russia.
The same U.S. embassy in Ukraine that believes in total transparency immediately scrubbed all evidence of these biolabs off of their website after Putin started to attack the military structures. But from these documents, you can see the locations, when they were built, and who funded it. It was the U.S. Department of Defense, and the addresses listed show these labs hosting these dangerous viruses. I don't feel comfortable with the state of these labs that are holding bioterrorism agents. Like, this one has a 1-star Google review. And they're trying to memory hole this and gaslight the global population like dozens of US-funded Ukrainian biolabs just never existed. On March 8th, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, casually mentioned in a Senate hearing to Marco Rubio that yes, in fact, the DoD does fund a series of biolabs in Ukraine.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities.
Russia has been warning the US for months to stop operating dangerous biolabs on their doorstep. Then on March 11th, Russia went to the UN Security Council to say that the US was illegally funding several bioweapons labs in Ukraine. If this is true, it would violate the UN Treaty Against Bioweapons. And it isn't just Russia that's concerned. During the emergency meeting, several countries called for an immediate investigation into Russia's allegations of biological warfare agents in Ukraine. And even Tulsi Gabbard spoke out about this.
Here are the undeniable facts. There are 25 to 30 US-funded biolabs in Ukraine. According to the US government, these biolabs are conducting research on dangerous pathogens.
According to Victoria Nuland, whatever is in these Ukrainian research labs is so dangerous that she is deeply concerned that these materials will fall into the hands of the Russian military.
So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
But in typical Pentagon fashion, these labs are marketed as defense. So how would it be dangerous then if Russia got their hands on defensive research? The Wuhan lab was also defensive research. So is US labeling these potential weapons of mass destruction as health facilities? That's like calling it a health nuke or a health rifle or a health plague. As if the label changes it? Don't worry, these viruses are peace viruses, not war viruses. After the truth came out that these facilities do indeed exist, the DoD tried its best to minimize the story and sent a fact sheet to the press stating that the Department of Defense, which is partnered with the CDC and the World Health Organization, which is of course funded largely by Bill Gates, has invested approximately $200 million into 46 Ukrainian laboratories and so-called health facilities. They say that they have worked with Ukraine to securely eliminate bioweapons left behind by the Soviet Union since 2005. So they've had 17 years and $200 million to destroy these viruses that they could just expose to light or heat or Lysol, and they still have them. So it's almost as if they're lying to us, even though according to Article 1 of the UN Treaty, they should never under any circumstance develop, produce, stockpile, acquire, or retain biological weapons. So retaining these viruses in these labs is illegal, which is probably why the Ukrainian Minister of Health and the World Health Organization has ordered the sudden disposal of these viruses in research. I don't know, if I was committing a crime and I just got caught committing the crime, I'd probably want to destroy the evidence of that crime as well. According to this leaked document from the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, they ordered the Laboratory of Bacteriology to destroy the following bacterias. The Geneva Convention, of course, prohibits the production of bacteriological weapons, and these aren't even the most deadly pathogens that they were supposedly researching. According to a deleted news article from 2010 that was scrubbed from the internet but archived, Senator Dick Lugar, who is named after his favorite sex move, said the Level 3 biosafety lab was used to study anthrax, tularemia, and Q fever, among others. The article goes on to say that the facility began in 2005 when he and then Senator Barack Obama entered a partnership with Ukrainian officials. In 2015, the Lugar Research Center in Georgia contracted Gilead Sciences, a private pharma company, to conduct medical experiments on hepatitis C. Russia alleged that they were using Georgian citizens as human guinea pigs to test a toxic experimental drug that resulted in an estimated 249 deaths. This was dismissed again as Russian disinformation. However, here are the documents that show that people did die spontaneously, including 30 people on the same day. The cause of death for many of these people was reported as unknown. No investigation was conducted into this. I'm not a detective, but maybe the thing that all of the people had in common that could link their sudden and mysterious deaths was the weird experimental drug that the US government was giving them. The experiment was backed by the CDC, and the Trump administration sued Gilead for profiting billions off of the CDC-funded research without paying any royalties. And Gilead was later caught paying $178 million to doctors to promote their drug despite these reports of death and severe side effects. So, weird, once again, Big Pharma is evil. But here's where things get really weird. Besides funding these labs in Ukraine, the Department of Defense also used an Air Force base in San Antonio, Texas, to study the human tissue and RNA material exclusively from Caucasian Russians. According to an official government website, the Department of Defense wanted to procure 27 normal human fresh frozen synovial tissue samples and 12 RNA samples from Russians. When asked, would you consider samples from Ukraine, they said no. All samples shall be collected from Russia and must be Caucasian. The government will not consider tissue samples from Ukraine. According to Igor Kurlov, the head of the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Protection Troops of the Russian Armed Forces, he says, we can say that one of the tasks of the United States and its allies is the creation of bioagents that can selectively affect various ethnic groups of the population. Now, I wonder if this is the evidence, materials, that have been destroyed right now under the orders of the World Health Organization and the Ministry of Ukraine. Because if biological weapons were being created to target a specific ethnicity, that would clearly violate the UN's treaty, and it sounds like a conspiracy to commit ethnic genocide. There is nothing defensive about that. The Russians also stated that the Pentagon is interested in insect vectors of dangerous infections with ectoparasites of bats, fleas, and ticks, which is probably also true because the US government and the CDC was funding research in Ukraine and Georgia to study viruses in bats and other animals. And this type of research goes back decades. In 1981, the US Army calculated that they could kill 625,000 people for just 30 cents per death by using mosquitoes infected with yellow fever and tularemia aerosol attacks. And even today, many of these viruses and bacteria being held in these labs are classified as bioterrorism agents by the CDC. Specific species of mosquitoes have been collected in Georgia and tested at the Luger Center. After their project in 2014, this mosquito breed was discovered in West Georgia where it hadn't existed prior, and they started to spread to neighboring countries such as Turkey and Russia. Between this and the Crimea River being dammed off, the ever-encroaching NATO around Russia's border, this was only a matter of time, especially after Zelensky said in April that if they couldn't join NATO, they would be acquiring nukes. So the Russians invaded because of threats of weapons of mass destruction. This seems to be an acceptable justification for when the US wants to invade another country, whether or not these weapons actually exist. What if American-instigated wars were covered by Western media the same way that they're covering the Russia-Ukraine war? Why were these labs being funded and researched in Ukraine and not in America? Was it just to be a direct threat to Russia? Why does Canada and the US send hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine in foreign aid every year? The U.S. Congress just approved $13.6 billion in war aid to Ukraine, and who knows if that'll even end up where it should? Who's checking? Ukraine has become a pay-for-play state led by an actual actor.
And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
In 2014, the U.S. government under Obama funded a $5 billion military coup against the democratically elected Ukrainian president, and then installed a new regime to act as a puppet government for the United States.
We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
The Western media is propping up Zelensky as some kind of hero, and multiple stories about Ukrainian military victories are being spread online, only to be debunked a day or two later. And you may totally disagree with me here, but in my opinion, Zelensky should have ended this with Russia weeks ago by accepting what the Russians have sought, which is a neutral Ukraine. But instead, he's putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk by maximizing civilian casualties to fuel Western outrage and to secure billions in funding from other countries. And unfortunately, civilians are once again caught in the crosshairs of corrupt government decisions, and they're paying the real price. Definitely is a real tragedy here, but the media is using that tragedy to manipulate people into cheering on a war with Russia and to excuse the billions of dollars that is going to Ukraine to fund it. Isn't it amazing how quickly the West just stopped talking about COVID altogether and immediately changed their social media statuses to praying for Ukraine? And now the US government is briefing TikTok stars on war in Ukraine so they can spread propaganda to tweens and Gen Z. Biden is also trying to blame the economy and gas prices on Putin as a scapegoat, despite prices rising before Russia even attacked Ukraine. I don't know, maybe printing infinite money has caused inflation. That's just basic economics. Or we could just blame Putin, I guess.
Second big reason for inflation is Vladimir Putin and gas prices. Not a joke.
Are you guys just going to start blaming Putin for everything?
Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
Anyway, since they market themselves as transparent, I reached out to the people who are allegedly committing bioterrorism and asked them some questions like, hey, are you guys committing bioterrorism? And why was the US military acquiring Russian RNA? And at first, the Department of Defense ghosted me like they ghosted all those civilians in Afghanistan, but then they emailed me back and did not answer a single question and said that the entire narrative was Russian disinformation. Probably in the same way that Hunter Biden's laptop was called Russian disinformation until they finally had to admit that it was real, which it obviously is. Did they want us to believe that Putin himself snuck into Hunter Biden's hotel room while he was sleeping and just put a crack pipe in his mouth? The difference between the truth being labeled as misinformation and it becoming mainstream news is about 1 to 2 years right now. Speaking of Hunter Biden, he's in this story too, so let's get into that. The company contracted to build these facilities in Ukraine is Black & Veatch, which partnered with a company called Metabiota, which was also contracted to the Department of Defense and awarded $18.4 million under the program in Georgia and Ukraine. Metabiota was also contracted by the DTRA before and during the Ebola crisis in West Africa, where 3 US biolabs are situated. The outbreak was blamed on bats, however, there is no conclusive evidence of how the virus jumped to humans. Metabiota got their real start with $30 million in funding from Rosemont Seneca, a company founded by Hunter Biden and John Kerry's stepson. Remember the Rosemont Seneca scandal? Where they were sent $3.5 million in a wire transfer from the wife of the former mayor of Moscow? Jen Psaki doesn't seem to have any information about that.
There was a report last year from the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committees. It claimed that the wife of Moscow's former mayor paid a company associated with the president's son $3.5 million. There was no explanation for this alleged payments, and I'm wondering if you could tell us if that claim is accurate, and if so, what the $3.5 million was paid for.
Not familiar with that claim. Doesn't sound like it's backed up by a lot of evidence. If you have evidence or specifics, happy to discuss it further.
Committee's report. So you haven't asked about this, or?
I'm not familiar with the report at all.
Metabiota's founder is Nathan Wolfe, and he's one of the World Economic Forum's young global leaders. You know, the organization where kids sorted into Slytherin end up as adults. Nathan serves on the editorial board for EcoHealth Alliance and is a member of DARPA's Defense Science Research Council, the organization that makes robot mosquitoes. Which, it probably isn't evil? He's received millions in funding from DARPA and Google. In 2013, Wolfe wrote a book called The Viral Storm, The Dawn of a New Pandemic Age, where he thanked his friend Jeffrey Epstein and Boris Nikolak, who was named Jeffrey Epstein's successor upon his totally not suspicious death. In 2015, Metabiota, EcoHealth Alliance, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology all worked together researching viruses from bats in China. Remember when Anthony Fauci was forced to admit that the NIH had distributed nearly $600,000 to EcoHealth Alliance, which went to China's Wuhan Institute of Virology to study coronaviruses? Well, they were working with Metabiota.
The U.S. funds around 300 biolabs around the world who are engaging in dangerous research, including gain of function, similar to the lab in Wuhan, where COVID-19 may have originated from. Now, after realizing how dangerous and vulnerable these labs are, they should have all been shut down 2 years ago.
What's going on in Ukraine at these labs is the same sort of shady research by the same sort of shady people that just ruined everyone's life on the planet for the last 2 years, which means they've either learned nothing from what just happened, or what just happened was intentional. Either way, why would we believe the lies told by the sociopaths who were just recently lying to us about the same thing?
It is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
Thank you so much for watching, and have a great night.